My family called me their failure, until Bride's multimillionaire father recognized my work. My family called me a failure for 15 straight years. Then my brother stole my work in my fiancé. He built an empire on my hands and my silence. I vanished into a garage, erased from my own name. 5 years later, I built again under a stranger's name. A wedding invitation arrived with my brother's name stamped proudly. The bride's father was the richest man in 3 states. What he found carved beneath the altar changed everything forever. My name is Daniel Reyes, 32 years old. And I grew up in the shadow of my older brother Ryan in a small furniture-making family outside Dayton, Ohio. Our grandfather built the shop with his own hands. My father inherited it, and everyone assumed Ryan would inherit it next. Because Ryan smiled easily and I did not. Our grandfather, Everett Reyes, taught both of us to work wood before we could tie our shoes, but only I stayed after school sanding boards until my palms bled, while Ryan wandered off to charm customers in the front showroom, learning to sell before he ever learned to build. By the time I was 17, I could dovetail a drawer blind, without a single visible joint, and Everett called me the best pair of hands he'd trained in 40 years. My father, Frank, nodded along but never once repeated those words to anyone outside that workshop. Ryan couldn't cut a straight line with a guide rail, but he could walk a client through a showroom and have them signing a deposit check within 20 minutes. My father decided, quietly and permanently, that charm was worth more than craft, and the family accepted his verdict without debate. At every dinner, my mother Carol would ask Ryan about his sales numbers, his golf handicap, his new truck, while my questions about a chair I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting got a polite nod and a change of subject towards something Ryan had said 5 minutes earlier. When Everett died, he left me his hand tools in his will, a small collection of chisels worn smooth by his grip. Ryan inherited the shop's ownership stake outright. Frank told me it was just business, and I told myself I believed him, because the alternative hurt too much. I built furniture in the back workshop for years, unseen, while Ryan's name went on every finished piece that left through the front door. Clients praised Ryan's incredible eye for design, without ever knowing the man they praised had never once touched a lathe in his life. My girlfriend at the time, Jenna Hale, worked the shop's books. She used to tell me my work was the reason the business survived, that she'd seen the actual production numbers and knew exactly whose hands built what. I believe she saw me. I was wrong about how much that mattered to her. The first real crack came the week Reyes Custom Furniture landed a magazine feature. The photographer wanted the designer for a portrait beside a walnut hutch I'd built alone over 6 weekends. Ryan straightened his collar, stepped into frame, and never once mentioned my name to the reporter. I confronted him quietly in the parking lot after, not yelling, just asking why. Ryan laughed, clapped my shoulder, and said, "Nobody wants to buy furniture from the guy in the back with sawdust in his hair. Danny, I'm the face. You're the hands. That's just how this works." I told myself hands mattered as much as faces. I told myself Dad would notice eventually, that the quality would speak for itself the way Everett always promised it would. I kept building. I kept believing patience was a kind of dignity. It was actually just a slow kind of disappearing. Frank started calling me into his office less. Ryan started attending client dinners I used to be invited to. Since he handles the relationships now, my paycheck stayed the same while the shop's revenue climbed 40% that year, almost entirely on pieces I had built with my own hands. Thanksgiving. My aunt asked what I'd been working on. Before I could answer, Ryan jumped in describing his newest collection, describing joinery techniques he couldn't actually name correctly, describing my work as though he'd dreamed it into existence himself while I sat there rearranging peas on my plate. Jenna squeezed my hand under the table that night. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the only honest thing happening in that entire house. I remember thinking, at least she sees it. At least one person in this family knows whose hands actually built the life we were living. I didn't know yet that seeing something and standing by it were two very different acts. And that Jenna, for all her quiet sympathy, had already started measuring my future against Ryan's rising one, doing the math on which brother was actually going somewhere in this family's eyes. The real fight started over a commission for a local church, an altar rail I designed from scratch after months of sketches. Ryan told the pastor he'd personally drafted every detail, and when I asked him afterward why he kept doing this, he shrugged and said credit was a business tool, not a truth. I told him I was done being invisible in my own family's shop. Ryan's face changed, the easy charm draining into something colder. You want your name on something, he said. Go build it somewhere else. See how far Danny Reyes gets without the Reyes name behind him. I brought it to Frank, laid out the numbers, showed him exactly which pieces I'd built versus which Ryan had merely sold. My father studied the ledger for a long moment, then closed it and said, "Your brother brings in the clients. Without clients, none of this matters. Let it go." So, that phrase, "let it go," became the answer to everything I raised for the next 2 years. It answered my request for a raise. It answered my request for my name on the workshop door. It answered every quiet, reasonable question I asked about why my work built a life I wasn't allowed to claim. Jenna started spending more time helping Ryan organize the front office. Her words, not mine. I told myself it was just proximity, just the natural overlap of working in the same building. I didn't yet let myself see the way she laughed differently around him than she ever had around me. My mother, Carol, took Ryan's side in every argument without ever appearing to choose a side at all. She had a gift for framing neutrality as fairness while somehow always landing exactly where Ryan needed her to land, nodding at his logic, softening his cruelty into something more palatable, more forgivable. I started keeping a private notebook, cataloging every piece I built, every client who unknowingly praised Ryan's vision, every dollar the shop earned off my labor. I told myself it was just for my own sanity. Some quiet part of me was already building a case I didn't yet know I'd need. The shop's biggest client that year was a regional hotel chain. 300 custom chairs for a lobby renovation. I built the prototype in 11 days straight, barely sleeping. Ryan presented it to the client alone, in a suit I'd never seen him buy, and returned with a 6-figure contract in his hand. At the contract celebration dinner, Frank raised a glass to Ryan's incredible year, and the whole table toasted him. I sat there with sawdust still under my fingernails from finishing the very chair everyone was celebrating, and nobody at that table looked at me even once during the entire toast. Jenna caught my eye across the table that night, and for a second I thought she might say something, might finally correct the room. Instead she looked down at her wine glass, and I understood, with a cold clarity, that her silence had a shape now, and that shape looked a lot like choosing him. I left the dinner early, drove to the empty workshop, and sat among the sawdust and half-finished chair frames until 2 in the morning. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was doing something worse. I was quietly, methodically, starting to believe they might actually be right about me. The next morning, Ryan handed me a stack of new orders from the hotel deal, expecting me to build all 300 chairs on the same salary I'd always earned. No bonus. No mention of the contract's value. Team effort, he said, smiling the same smile that used to make me trust him. Asked calmly what my cut of the deal would be. Ryan laughed like I told a joke. Your cut, he said, is that you still have a job here. Danny. Not everyone gets that luxury. Be grateful you've got steady work while the rest of the world's out there struggling. That night I opened my old laptop and, almost as an experiment, listed a single side table online under a made-up name, just to see what would happen if my work stood entirely on its own, with no brother's face, no family name, nothing but the wood and the joints speaking for themselves. The table sold in 4 days to a buyer in Chicago. No negotiation. Full asking price. I stared at that notification longer than I'd stared at anything in months. It was the first time in my adult life that money had come to me purely because of something I'd built with my hands. I didn't tell anyone. Not Ryan. Not my parents. Not even Jenna. I told myself it was nothing. A fluke. A hobby. But I started sketching new pieces at night after shop hours. Pieces with my own signature style. Pieces nobody at Reyes Custom Furniture had approved or claimed or diluted. Meanwhile, at the shop, Ryan's confidence hardened into something sharper. He started correcting my technique in front of clients. Technique he barely understood. Just to look authoritative. I began biting my tongue so often I started to wonder if I even had opinions left. Or just reflexes trained into silence. Frank promoted Ryan to general manager that spring. A title with a raise. An office upgrade. And full authority over production decisions. Which in practice meant Ryan now had the power to approve or reject my designs before they ever reached a client. Using taste he borrowed entirely from watching me for years. I remember the exact day Ryan rejected a chair design I'd spent a month perfecting, telling me it was too complicated for the average buyer. Then quietly modifying 2 details and presenting an almost identical version 3 weeks later as his own simplified concept. To genuine applause from our father. Jenna found me in the workshop that night. Saw my face. And for once didn't pretend not to notice. "You should say something," she said. I asked her why she never did. She looked away and said something about not wanting to make things harder for everyone. As if my silence wasn't already the hardest thing happening. I started staying later at the shop. Not to work on Reyes projects, but to secretly build pieces for my growing online store, which I'd named Hollow Oak, after the ancient white oak tree behind Everett's original workshop, the one place in my childhood that had never once made me feel small. Hollow Oak grew slowly but steadily. A coffee table sold to a designer in Austin. A bookshelf sold to a couple in Seattle. Each sale felt like a small, private rebellion. Proof that somewhere out in the world, strangers valued exactly the thing my own family had spent years dismissing without a second thought. I carved a tiny oak leaf into the underside of every hollow oak piece. A private signature nobody but me would ever notice. A habit Everett had taught me as a boy. "Mark your work where only you'll find it," he used to say. "Let the wood remember. Even if nobody else does." Ryan noticed my exhaustion at work and assumed it was from Reyes projects, praising himself for keeping the production line efficient. He had no idea I was building a second, secret career every night after he went home to the apartment he now shared. More and more often. With Jenna, that revelation came slowly, then all at once. A missed call from Jenna returned to voicemail. A jacket of hers left at Ryan's apartment, mentioned casually by my mother. A silence between the two of them at dinner that felt too comfortable, too rehearsed. Like something already settled long before I noticed it forming. I asked Jenna directly, one evening in the shop parking lot, if something was happening between her and my brother. She didn't deny it immediately, which told me everything before her actual words did. "It just happened," she said. "You've been so distant, Daniel. Ryan actually sees me. He actually shows up." I wanted to laugh at the irony, that the woman who used to praise my invisible craftsmanship in private now wanted a man who was famous for taking credit in public. But I didn't laugh. I just nodded. The way I'd learned to nod at everything this family handed me, and walked away quietly. Word spread fast in our small town. My mother called it complicated but understandable. My father called it not really our business. Ryan called me 2 days later, casual as ever, asking if we were still cool, as though he hadn't just taken the last thing in my life that hadn't already been his. I told him we were fine, because I didn't yet have the words for what we actually were, and because some exhausted part of me had already accepted that in this family, my feelings were always the negotiable variable, the thing everyone assumed would eventually just settle itself quietly, without consequence. Hollow Oak became the only place I felt like myself. I stopped answering family group texts as quickly. I started spending Sundays at the workshop alone, building pieces nobody in my bloodline would ever see. Pieces that would travel to strangers' homes and simply exist, unclaimed by anyone but me. A buyer named David, no last name given, purchased 3 hollow oak pieces within 2 months, always paying full price without negotiation, always leaving the same short, precise feedback, exceptional joinery, rare patience in the work. We'll be watching for more. I saved that message. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. At the shop, Ryan announced a major expansion, a second location downtown, funded partly by a loan Frank co-signed using the original building as collateral, the same building Everett had built with tools now sitting quietly in my apartment, tools nobody at Reyes Custom Furniture even remembered existed anymore. I asked what my role would be at the new location. Ryan said, same as always, keep building, but the tone made clear he meant it as a demotion dressed as consistency, a way of confirming, without saying it outright, that I would remain permanently, comfortably, invisible in the business bearing my own last name. I started quietly transferring my personal client list, the small handful of Reyes customers who'd specifically requested the guy in the back after seeing my work, moving their contact information into a private folder labeled simply Hollow Oak, unsure yet why I felt the need to protect it so carefully. Jenna and Ryan announced their engagement 6 weeks after the affair became public knowledge. A ring photo posted online with a caption thanking everyone who supported us through this journey, as though heartbreak were a hurdle they'd cleared together, rather than a wound they'd carved into someone still standing in the same family. My mother cried happy tears at the announcement dinner. My father raised a toast to new beginnings. I sat at the far end of the table, the same seat I'd occupied at the hotel contract dinner, watching my family celebrate a wound as though it were simply a milestone on a calendar. I left before dessert that night, drove straight to the workshop, and finished a walnut writing desk I'd been slowly building for 3 weeks. I carved the oak leaf into its underside at 1 in the morning, hand steady despite everything, and understood clearly that this was the only steadiness left in my life. Hollow oak orders kept climbing. I hired a part-time assistant, a retired carpenter named Walt who asked no questions and worked with the quiet precision Everett used to demand. Walt became the first person outside my anonymous customers to see the full scope of what I was quietly building for myself. You've got real talent, kid, Walt told me one afternoon, examining a finished cabinet, the kind that doesn't need a name attached to prove itself. I didn't tell him about Ryan, about the shop, about any of it. I just said thanks, and let the compliment sit somewhere it could actually be believed. Reyes Custom Furniture's new downtown location opened with a ribbon-cutting event covered by the local paper. Ryan gave a speech about legacy and vision. I stood near the back in an ill-fitting suit my mother had insisted I wear, watching my brother describe a legacy built almost entirely on my labor. A reporter asked Ryan about his creative process. He described, in detail, techniques I had personally taught him just to keep him from ruining client orders, presenting them as his own hard-won discoveries. I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, like a held breath that had lasted years. Frank pulled me aside at the event, told me how proud he was of what this family built, asked, quietly, if that included me. He looked genuinely confused by the question, as though the possibility that I might need acknowledgement too had simply never crossed his mind in any real way. That night I went home and looked at David's latest message on Hollow Oak. Another purchase. Another short note of praise. This time asking if I ever took custom commissions for a significant private event. I replied yes, cautiously, still not knowing this stranger's real name or the size of the world behind it. David's commission request arrived days later. A full set of ceremonial furniture, an altar table, matching chairs, a signing table, for what he called a small family wedding scheduled for late autumn. The budget attached made me sit down twice to reread the number, certain I'd misunderstood a decimal point. I accepted the commission without knowing who David really was, only that his emails were precise, respectful, and entirely focused on the work itself, a quality I hadn't experienced from a client in years. I began sketching the pieces that night, energized in a way Reyes custom furniture hadn't made me feel in ages. At the shop, Ryan grew paranoid about the downtown location's slow early sales, blaming everyone but himself. He started demanding I work weekends to build inventory, unaware I was already spending every spare hour on the largest, most important commission of my life, one he knew absolutely nothing about. Jenna, now wearing Ryan's ring, stopped by the workshop one evening while I was finishing a chair leg, the wood catching the last of the daylight. "You seem different lately," she said. "Lighter." "Almost." I told her I'd found something that was entirely mine. She didn't ask what. I didn't offer. Frank began pressuring me to sign a new employment contract, one that formalized what had always been informally true. Full ownership of all designs produced under the Reyes custom furniture name would belong exclusively to the company, meaning to Ryan, meaning I would legally lose any claim to my own creative work. I stalled on signing, telling Frank I wanted my lawyer to review it, a small lie that bought me time. In reality, I spent that time quietly building David's commission piece by piece in the evenings, carving the oak leaf into each one, feeling, for the first time in years, entirely unhidden. Ryan cornered me about the contract delay, accusing me of overthinking a formality. I told him I just wanted to understand what I was agreeing to, he said, with a laugh that had lost all its old warmth. "Danny, you're not exactly walking away from a bidding war for your services. Just sign it." That comment stayed with me for days. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it revealed exactly how little my brother understood about what I'd quietly become. Somewhere out there, a stranger named David was paying more for 6 pieces of my furniture than Reyes paid me in half a year. My mother called to ask why I hadn't signed the contract yet, framing it as a favor to Ryan, to keep the family business simple. I asked her, for the first time in my life, whether she'd ever once considered that the family business had been built almost entirely on my unsigned, uncredited work. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Your brother has always needed more encouragement than you did. You've always been the strong one." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark workshop for a long time, turning that sentence over, understanding finally what it had actually cost me. I finished David's commission 2 weeks ahead of schedule, an altar table with hidden joinery so precise it required no visible hardware, 6 matching chairs, and a signing table with a subtle inlaid oak leaf pattern along its edge, disguised as simple ornamentation to anyone who didn't already know to look for it. David's response, when I sent final photos, was longer than any message he'd sent before. "This is the finest ceremonial furniture I have owned in 30 years of collecting," he wrote. "I would very much like to meet the person behind Hollow Oak in person, when circumstances allow. Thank you. Truly." For a few weeks after shipping David's commission, things went quiet. The shop settled into its usual rhythm. Ryan's downtown location finally picked up steam. My contract dispute stayed unresolved but unpressed. I let myself exhale, cautiously, the way you do after surviving a storm you're not sure has actually passed. Jenna and Ryan's wedding planning consumed most family conversations that autumn, guest lists and venues and cake tastings discussed at every dinner as though nothing painful had ever happened to arrive at this particular celebration. I learned to nod along, to pass the potatoes, to survive an hour at a time. Hollow Oak's reputation grew quietly within a small, discerning circle of collectors. I started receiving inquiries from interior designers who specifically wanted the maker with the hidden leaf mark, a phrase that had apparently begun circulating without my knowledge among people who noticed details most buyers never even considered. Walt suggested I hire another set of hands. That demand was outpacing what 2 people could reasonably produce. I hesitated, still cautious about growing too visible, too findable. Worried some part of my old life might come looking for the thing I'd finally built without their permission or their name attached. I visited Everett's grave that autumn, something I hadn't done in over a year. I told him, quietly, about Hollow Oak, About the leaf mark. About the strange, generous stranger named David who seemed to understand the work better than my own father ever had. Felt briefly entirely at peace. Frank mentioned, almost in passing at dinner, that Ryan had landed a massive private client for the downtown location, someone connected to a major real estate family, though he wouldn't share details. Citing an NDA Ryan had insisted on for competitive reasons nobody else at the table thought to question. I didn't think much of it at the time. Big clients came and went at Reyes Custom Furniture. Most were forgotten within a season. I had no reason yet to connect Ryan's mysterious new contract to the quiet, precise commission I'd already completed and shipped weeks earlier under an entirely different name. Jenna asked me, unexpectedly, to help pick out groomsmen suits with Ryan, since you're still his brother. Even now, I declined as gently as I could manage. She looked hurt, as though my absence from her wedding preparations were an unreasonable request rather than the bare minimum of self-preservation I had left. I threw myself into Hollow Oak instead, taking on 3 new commissions in a single month, each one a small proof to myself that I could build a life entirely outside the walls my family had built around me since childhood. Walls I was only now beginning to fully understand had never been load-bearing. David reached out again in early November, this time with an unusual request. He wanted to fly me out, all expenses covered, to personally install the altar and signing table myself at the venue, rather than trust shipping and local assembly. Your hands built it, he wrote. Your hands should place it. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Something about the request felt significant in a way I couldn't yet articulate. A small, growing sense that this commission was not simply another sale, but a hinge point I hadn't yet recognized was quietly turning beneath the surface of my ordinary, exhausted life. The wedding location David gave me was a private estate outside Charlotte, North Carolina, a name I didn't recognize attached to a venue I'd never heard of. I booked the flight for the same weekend my family had circled on their calendars for months, though I had no reason yet to think the dates connected. 2 days before I was set to fly out, my mother called, breathless with excitement, to tell me Ryan had landed the wedding of the year. A private estate wedding in North Carolina for some billionaire's daughter, furniture contract worth more than the entire downtown location's annual revenue combined. Asked, almost idly, the family's last name. My mother said she couldn't remember exactly, something like Whitford or Whitfield. She thought, but that it didn't matter, because Ryan had apparently wowed them completely with his portfolio during the pitch meeting 3 months earlier, back before I'd even met David. I told myself it was a coincidence, a common enough name, an unremarkable overlap in a country full of wealthy families hosting autumn weddings. I packed my tools that night anyway, carefully, the way Everett had taught me, laying each chisel into its slot like a small, quiet ritual before travel. At the shop the next morning, Ryan was practically vibrating with excitement, showing everyone printed photos of the estate venue, a sprawling white house with a chapel on the grounds, describing the custom altar and chairs he'd personally designed for the ceremony as though the words tasted especially sweet in his mouth. I glanced at the photo over his shoulder and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. The altar in the printout was mine, the joinery unmistakable, the proportions I'd spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting, the exact piece I had shipped months earlier to a client I knew only by the name David. I said nothing in that moment, some old, well-worn instinct for self-protection kicking in before I'd even fully processed what I was seeing. I excused myself to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my own reflection until my breathing finally slowed back into something manageable. I pulled up my Hollow Oak records that night, cross-referencing shipping addresses, and confirmed what some sick, sinking part of me had already known standing in that workshop. The estate address matched exactly. Ryan hadn't designed anything. He had simply photographed my finished work and claimed it as his portfolio piece. I sat with that knowledge for a long time, turning it over like a stone in my palm. Not shock exactly, more strange, Bitter confirmation of a pattern I'd lived inside my entire adult life, now stretched to a scale so absurd it almost made me laugh out loud in the dark. The next question mattered more. How had Ryan even known about my work? About Hollow Oak? About a commission I'd kept entirely separate from the family? I dug further into my records and found my answer in an old, forgotten shared cloud folder. One Ryan still had access to from years earlier. I'd used that folder once, months back, to store reference photos while sketching David's commission, forgetting entirely that Ryan's login credentials had never been removed after he'd helped set up the family's shared drive back when we still pretended to be building something together instead of apart. Ryan had found my photos, my sketches, my finished pieces, and simply presented them to the Whitfield family's event planner as his own portfolio, never once suspecting the actual maker would end up standing in his own family's workshop, close enough to recognize his own signature carving in a stolen printout. I thought about confronting him immediately, about laying the truth on the table the way I tried to do so many times before. But something stopped me this time. Colder, more patient instinct I didn't fully recognize in myself. Something that wanted proof laid out in full before I said a single word. I called David that evening, using the number from an old shipping confirmation, my hands not entirely steady as it rang. When he answered, I explained, carefully, that I believed his daughter's wedding furniture contract had been awarded under false pretenses, and that I was the actual maker of the pieces he already owned. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I worried the call had dropped. Then David said, slowly, I had a feeling something didn't add up when the man who pitched me couldn't answer a single technical question about his own so-called design. Tell me everything, Daniel. From the beginning. I told him everything. The years of uncredited work, the stolen credit, the affair, the contract designed to sign away my rights, the folder Ryan had raided without my knowledge. David listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, his voice had changed, quieter, harder, unmistakably angry on my behalf. I don't like being lied to, David said. And I especially don't like it when the lie tries to erase the actual craftsman standing behind work I've admired for months. Come to the wedding as planned, Daniel. Install the pieces yourself, exactly as we discussed. Let your brother keep talking. I'll listen carefully. I asked what he meant by that, and David simply said he wanted to see how far the lie would stretch before it broke on its own weight. That some truths were more powerful revealed publicly, in the moment, then argued quietly behind closed doors where they could be smoothed over and denied. I agreed, though my hand shook slightly setting down the phone. For the first time in 15 years, someone with real power in a room was choosing to stand quietly beside me instead of beside the version of events my family had always preferred, the version where I simply didn't count. I flew to Charlotte 3 days later, telling my family only that I had some personal business that weekend, which wasn't entirely a lie. Ryan assumed I'd be watching a live stream of the wedding like the rest of the family, never imagining I'd already be standing on the grounds before he even arrived. David met me personally at the estate gate. A tall man in his 60s with an unhurried handshake and eyes that studied things carefully before speaking. So you're the Hands, he said, almost smiling. I've been wondering what kind of man builds furniture with this much patience in it. Now I know. Walking the grounds with him, past the chapel where my altar already stood exactly where I'd installed it weeks earlier, David told me his own story. A self-made real estate developer who'd started as a carpenter's apprentice, who still valued handmade craftsmanship above almost anything money could otherwise simply purchase outright. I've bought a lot of furniture in my life, he said, running a hand along the signing table's edge, finding the hidden oak leaf inlay without me pointing it out. Most of it forgettable. Yours isn't. I noticed this marked the first week I owned your desk. I've been looking for you ever since. I asked how he'd connected the dots to Ryan's pitch meeting months earlier. David explained that his event planner had flagged inconsistencies early, Ryan's inability to answer basic construction questions, a suspiciously perfect match to photos David had privately saved from his own hollow oak purchases, details Ryan had no way of explaining. I let it play out, David admitted. Partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see exactly how comfortable a man could get lying to my face before the truth caught up with him. I didn't expect the truth to arrive wearing his own last name, though. That part surprised even me. We walked through the reception hall together, where more furniture stood, pieces Ryan had commissioned from other legitimate vendors to fill out the order he couldn't actually produce himself. Pieces of noticeably lower quality standing awkwardly beside my own work like understudies next to the only performer who actually knew their lines. David asked if I'd be willing to stay through the ceremony. Not as staff. Not hidden. But present. Close enough to see how things unfolded. I told him honestly that some part of me wanted exactly that. A chance to finally stand in a room where the truth had somewhere real to land. That evening, at the rehearsal, Ryan arrived in a rented tuxedo, radiating the particular confidence of a man who believed he'd already won something significant. He didn't notice me at first, tucked near the catering staff entrance, dressed simply, watching him accept compliments on his altar from Whitfield family members. I watched Jenna arrive with him, laughing at something he'd said, utterly unaware that the very furniture surrounding her had been built by the man she'd left behind, the man whose hands she'd once praised in private before deciding those hands weren't the ones worth staying for after all. Frank and Carol arrived the next morning for the ceremony itself, dressed in their best clothes, beaming with pride at their son's supposed triumph. I stayed out of their line of sight deliberately, not ready yet for that particular confrontation, wanting the truth to arrive on its own terms, in its own order. The ceremony venue filled with guests, easily 200 people, industry names I recognized from magazine spreads Ryan used to leave lying around the house, hoping someone might mistake ambition for accomplishment. I stood near the back with David's event coordinator, my pulse steady despite everything building quietly around me. Just before the ceremony began, a minor mechanical issue emerged. One of the signing table's drawer mechanisms, a subtle hidden compartment I'd built for the family's ceremonial pen, had jammed slightly during transport, sticking just enough to be noticeable if someone tried to open it in front of 200 watching guests. The wedding coordinator, unaware of who I actually was, approached Ryan in a panic, asking him to quickly fix it before the ceremony started. Ryan stared at the drawer, turned it over twice, pressed uselessly at the seam, and visibly began to sweat under the weight of 200 waiting guests. He had no idea how the mechanism worked, because he had never built it, had never even seen its internal design, had only ever seen the finished, polished surface of a piece he'd claimed as his own without understanding a single joint holding it together beneath that surface. I watched him fumble for nearly a full minute, his easy charm draining visibly from his face, replaced by something close to panic. The coordinator asked, increasingly urgent, if there was anyone else who understood the piece's construction, anyone at all who could fix it before the bride arrived at the chapel doors. David, standing calmly nearby the entire time, finally spoke. Actually, he said, loud enough for the small cluster of nearby guests to hear, I believe the man who can fix that is standing right over there. He gestured toward me, and every head near the altar turned in my direction at once. Ryan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally something close to horror. As I stepped forward from the catering entrance where I'd been standing, calm in a way that surprised even me, and walked directly toward the table my own hands had built months earlier. Daniel, he said, my name coming out strangled, unfamiliar in his mouth after months of using it only to describe someone conveniently absent. What are you doing here? I didn't answer him directly. I simply knelt beside the drawer, found the small release catch hidden along the underside, and pressed it gently. The drawer slid open smoothly, exactly as it was always designed to, revealing the ceremonial pen resting undisturbed inside. A small, Quiet triumph in front of 200 people who had no idea they were watching the actual maker of every piece surrounding them finally step out of 15 years of shadow. A ripple of relieved applause moved through the small crowd gathered near the chapel entrance. The kind of polite, automatic applause people offer any minor crisis resolved quickly. Ryan stood frozen beside me, his mouth slightly open, clearly trying to construct an explanation for a situation he didn't yet understand had already collapsed. "How did you know how to fix that?" he asked quietly. "Just between us." His voice stripped of its usual performance. I looked at him steadily and said, "Because I built it, Ryan. Every joint, every mechanism, every piece standing in this chapel came out of my workshop, not yours. You just took the photos." His face went pale in a way I'd genuinely never seen before. 15 years of easy confidence finally meeting a fact it couldn't smooth over or spin into something more flattering. "That's not," he started, then stopped, glancing nervously at David, who was watching the entire exchange with quiet, deliberate attention. "That's not what?" David asked pleasantly, stepping closer. "Not true?" "Because I'd love to hear you explain, in detail, exactly how the joinery on that altar works. Ryan, walk me through the hidden compartment mechanism you supposedly designed. I'm genuinely curious to hear the explanation from the man who pitched it to me." Ryan opened his mouth twice and said nothing coherent either time. The small crowd nearby had grown slightly larger now, drawn by the tension rather than the drama, the way people always are, sensing something significant unfolding even before they understood exactly what it was they were witnessing. "I don't actually think you can explain it," David continued, his voice calm but carrying easily across the gathering crowd, "because I don't think you built any of this. I think you photographed someone else's work, presented it as your own in our pitch meeting, and hoped nobody would ever check the details closely." Frank pushed through the small crowd at that moment, having heard the commotion from across the lawn, Carol close behind him, both of them arriving just in time to witness their golden son standing speechless beside the brother they'd spent 15 years calling, quietly and consistently, the family's disappointment. "What's going on here?" Frank demanded, looking between Ryan's ashen face and my steady one, clearly trying and failing to fit this scene into any version of the story he told himself about his sons for the past decade and a half of carefully managed family narrative. "Your son," David said, gesturing at Ryan, "won my daughter's wedding contract by presenting someone else's furniture as his own portfolio. Your other son," he continued, nodding toward me, "is the actual craftsman. I've been buying his work for months under the name Hollow Oak, long before this wedding was ever planned." Frank's face shifted through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably close to dawning recognition, as though somewhere underneath the surface, he'd always suspected the true source of the shop's finest work and had simply chosen, year after year, not to look too closely at the answer. Carol's hand went to her mouth, and for a moment I thought I saw something genuine in her expression. Not performance, not damage control, but actual shock at watching 15 years of carefully maintained family mythology crack open in front of 200 wedding guests she'd never met. "Daniel," Frank said, my name sounding strange and unfamiliar coming from him in that context. "Is this true?" I looked at my father, this man who told me over and over to let it go, and said simply, "Everything you told me not to worry about turned out to matter, Dad. All of it." The wedding coordinator, sensing the ceremony's timeline slipping away, gently tried to redirect everyone's attention, asking guests to please take their seats. The bride would be arriving shortly. David held up a hand, unhurried, entirely unbothered by any social pressure to smooth the moment over for the sake of schedule. "One more thing," David said, turning to face Ryan directly. "The contract you signed with my event planning team included a clause about accurate representation of your portfolio and work history. I'd like my lawyer to review whether that clause has been materially breached before this event concludes today." Ryan's composure, The last visible piece of it finally shattered entirely. "David." "Please," he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard from my brother, not even as a child. "I can explain. This isn't. It's not as simple as it looks. There's context you're missing here." "I'd love context," David said evenly. "Explain to me how photographing another man's finished work and presenting it as your own original design in a formal client pitch meeting has context that makes it something other than fraud."
"I'm genuinely listening."
"Ryan, take your time. We have a few minutes before the ceremony." Ryan had no answer. Because there was no answer. Because the truth was exactly as simple and as damning as it appeared. Stripped finally of the charm and confidence that had spent 15 years disguising a fundamental absence of the actual skill everyone had assumed, without ever verifying, that he possessed. Jenna arrived at that moment, drawn by the growing crowd, wedding program still in her hand, and froze when she saw me standing beside Ryan and David, understanding immediately, from the expressions alone, that something significant had shifted in the 15 minutes since she'd last checked on her fiancé's whereabouts. "What happened?" she asked, looking between us. Ryan opened his mouth, but David answered before he could. "Your fiancé built his entire business relationship with my family on furniture your former partner actually made. I imagine that's a conversation the two of you have some catching up to do on later." Jenna's face went through the same sequence of shock I'd watched move across my father's expression minutes earlier. The slow, uncomfortable arrival of a truth that had apparently been visible the entire time, hidden in plain sight, if anyone had simply cared enough to look closely at the man they'd chosen. "You told me you designed all of this," she said quietly to Ryan, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from her in years. "You told me this contract was going to change everything for us." Ryan didn't answer. He just stood there, the silence itself becoming its own confession in front of everyone. The wedding coordinator, increasingly desperate to salvage the timeline, gently suggested the family continue this conversation privately while guests took their seats for the ceremony. David nodded, finally relenting, though his eyes stayed on Ryan a moment longer, cold and unmistakably final in their assessment. "We'll finish this conversation after the ceremony," David said. "My daughter's wedding day isn't the venue for further discussion. But make no mistake, Ryan, this isn't over. My legal team will be reviewing every contract your company has with my family by end of week." As the crowd dispersed toward their seats, Frank pulled me aside, his hand shaking slightly on my arm, a gesture I couldn't remember him ever making before in my entire life. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, voice low, almost desperate. "All this time, why didn't you say something, Daniel?" "I tried," I said, and I let that answer sit there, unadorned. Because it was true. Because I'd tried for 15 years in every quiet, patient way I knew how, and every single time, the answer had come back the same. Let it go. Don't make things difficult. Be grateful for what you have. Frank had no response to that. For the first time in my adult life, I watched my father run out of words entirely, standing there in his rented chair section, confronting the accumulated weight of every small dismissal he'd handed his younger son across 2 decades of careful, comfortable inattention. The ceremony proceeded, strange and surreal. The bride walking down an aisle flanked by furniture that had just publicly exposed her father's contractor as a fraud minutes earlier. I sat quietly near the back beside Walt, who David had also invited, having met him briefly during an earlier commission conversation. Sophie Whitfield, the bride, married her fiancé beneath an altar I had built with my own hands, unaware during the ceremony itself of the full drama that had unfolded just before her walk down the aisle, present only in the careful, worried glances her father kept sending toward the back of the chapel. After the ceremony concluded, David found me near the reception tent. His expression softened now, some of the earlier hardness replaced with something closer to warmth. "I'm sorry that had to happen the way it did," he said. But I wasn't going to let it happen quietly. Not to work this good. Thank you, I said. And meant it more deeply than those two small words could really carry. David studied me for a moment, then said, I don't think you understand yet what you actually did here today, Daniel. You didn't just fix a drawer. You finally made your family see you. All of them. At once. Ryan found me an hour later, near the edge of the reception grounds, his tuxedo jacket gone, tie loosened, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him look in his entire adult life. You could have warned me, he said, anger and desperation tangled together in his voice. You could have given me a chance. You had 15 years of chances. Ryan, I said quietly. Every dinner. Every contract. Every time I asked for my name on something I built with my own hands. You had all the chances in the world. You just never once thought I was worth taking one of them seriously. He didn't have an answer for that either. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, the golden child finally confronted with the full weight of a story he'd spent his entire life editing to keep himself comfortably at the center of it, at everyone else's quiet, accumulating expense. Jenna approached separately, later, finding me near the parking area as I loaded my tools back into my rental car. I didn't know, she said, about any of it. Daniel. The stolen designs. The contract. I swear I didn't know he was doing that. I believed her. It didn't change much. You knew I built things nobody credited me for, I said. Not cruelly. Just honestly. You knew that for years. This wasn't a surprise about what Ryan was capable of. It was just a bigger version of something you'd already watched happen plenty of times before and never said a word about. She didn't argue with that. She just stood there, tears gathering, and finally said, I'm sorry, in a voice that sounded like she meant it, even if it arrived several years and one entire engagement too late to change anything meaningful about where either of us actually stood now. I drove back to my hotel that night alone, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the flight or the long day. A bone-deep tiredness that came from finally setting down a weight I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying for 15 consecutive years of my adult life. David called the following morning, his voice businesslike but warm. I've had my legal team review the contract situation, he said. Ryan's company is being formally terminated from every remaining project with my family, effective immediately. I'd like to discuss something entirely different with you, if you have time this week. We met for coffee near the Charlotte airport before my flight home. David laid out an offer. Significant investment capital for Hollow Oak. Full creative control remaining with me. Distribution connections he built across 3 decades in real estate and hospitality. Access to clients who valued exactly the kind of work I did. I don't do this for everyone, he said, sliding a folder across the table. I do it when I see something rare. Someone who builds with actual patience instead of shortcuts. Your brother sold my family a photograph. You built something that will still be standing in this world long after both of us are gone. I asked him why he'd taken such a personal interest in exposing Ryan rather than simply quietly switching vendors and moving on, which would have been far easier, far less public, far less complicated for a man with his resources and reputation to manage in the middle of his daughter's wedding weekend. Because craftsmen like you get erased constantly, David said, by people who are better at talking than building. I've watched it happen my whole career. In construction. In business. Everywhere. Someone finally needed to say it out loud, in front of the people who'd spent years pretending not to see it. I signed the investment agreement 2 weeks later, after my own lawyer reviewed every line carefully, finding nothing but exactly what David had promised. Capital. Creative freedom. And a partnership built on the actual work rather than the story someone told about the work to make it more marketable. Word of what happened at the Whitfield wedding spread quickly through certain circles, the kind of quiet, high-value social network David moved within. And Hollow Oak's commission requests tripled within a month, each new client specifically mentioning the wedding, the drawer. The moment the truth had simply, undeniably, stood up in a chapel. Reyes Custom Furniture's downtown location, meanwhile, collapsed within weeks. Word traveled fast in the small, tightly connected world of high-end regional clients, and Ryan's remaining contracts began evaporating one by one as people quietly, carefully distanced themselves from a name now associated with public fraud at a billionaire's daughter's wedding. Frank called me almost every day that first month. Awkward, halting conversations that circled the same unspoken apology without quite landing on the actual words. I let him circle. I wasn't in a hurry to make this easy for him. Not after 15 years of being told my own feelings were the inconvenient variable. Carol sent a long letter instead of calling, admitting things she'd never said aloud, that she'd always known, on some level, whose hands actually built the family's reputation, and had chosen comfort and peace over confronting Frank and Ryan about it, choosing the easier lie, year after year, over the harder truth. I read her letter twice, sitting alone in my new workshop, the one David's investment had funded, twice the size of the old family shop, filled with equipment Everett could only have dreamed about. I didn't respond right away. Some wounds needed more than a letter to actually start closing properly. Jenna reached out one final time. A short message asking if we could talk sometime. No pressure. Whenever I was ready. I never responded. Some doors, I learned, were better left exactly where they closed. Not out of bitterness anymore, but out of a simple, clear-eyed understanding of who I actually needed around me now. Ryan tried once, showing up unannounced at my new workshop 3 months later. Looking older, thinner. The confidence that used to fill every room he entered now visibly diminished. I lost the business, he said quietly. I lost basically everything. I don't know how to fix any of this. Daniel. I looked at my brother. This man who'd spent 15 years building his identity on the foundation of my erased labor, and felt, surprisingly, no particular satisfaction in his ruin, only a tired, distant kind of clarity. I'm not the person who can fix it for you, I said. I never was. Actually, he asked, quietly, if there was any chance we could rebuild something between us eventually. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that some things took longer to heal than others, and that the healing, whatever shape it eventually took, would have to happen on my timeline now, not his. He nodded, accepting that with a humility I'd genuinely never seen from him before, and left without pushing further, which felt, in its own small way, like the first honest interaction we'd had as adults in longer than either of us could probably accurately remember at that point. 6 months after the wedding, Hollow Oak officially became Hollow Oak Reyes Design Studio, my full name finally attached to the work publicly. No alias. No hiding. No carved leaf as a secret substitute for the acknowledgement I'd spent 15 years quietly, desperately wishing someone would simply offer me first. David commissioned a second, larger project that spring, an entire dining hall for a new hospitality venture he was launching, and asked me to design it from the ground up. Full creative authority. My name on every piece of marketing material. Exactly the credit I'd once been told, repeatedly, wasn't worth pursuing. I hired Walt full-time, then 2 more craftsmen, building a small team of people who valued precision the way Everett had taught me to. People who understood that the quiet work, the patient work, the work nobody photographs for magazine spreads, is often the work that actually holds everything else together. My father visited the new workshop for the first time that summer, standing quietly among the finished pieces, running his hand along a cabinet edge the way Everett used to. This is incredible, Daniel, he said. And for once, the words didn't feel like an afterthought squeezed in after praising someone else. I should have said that 15 years ago, Frank added, and I told him, honestly, that he should have. That the apology mattered but couldn't undo the years. That we were starting from somewhere new now, not somewhere repaired. Because some structures, Once cracked deeply enough, simply had to be rebuilt from different foundations. He accepted that without argument, which was, in its own quiet way, more progress than 15 years of dinners and dismissals had ever produced between us. A small, genuine shift in a relationship that had spent most of my life defined entirely by his son's comfort rather than mine. Carol started visiting the workshop occasionally too, bringing coffee, watching quietly as I worked, never pushing conversation, simply present in a way she'd never quite managed to be during the years it would have actually mattered most. I let her stay. I didn't rush toward forgiveness, but I didn't block the door either. Ryan eventually found work at a smaller furniture company 2 towns over. Starting again from close to nothing. No management title. No downtown location. Just an entry-level sales position built on rebuilding trust one honest transaction at a time. A lesson 15 years of easy success had never once required him to learn. I heard through my mother that he'd started actually learning basic woodworking techniques in his spare time. Slowly. Imperfectly. The way beginners always do. I didn't know what to make of that yet. Maybe it was genuine. Maybe it was performance. Time, I'd learn, was usually the only honest judge of either. A year after the wedding, David invited me back to the Whitfield estate for Sophie's first anniversary celebration. This time not as a hidden craftsman working through the catering entrance, but as an honored guest. Seated at the main table, introduced to arriving guests as the artist behind everything you're standing on. I walked through the same chapel where everything had changed, running my hand along the altar's edge, finding the small oak leaf I'd carved there. No longer hidden. No longer a private signature meant only for my own quiet reassurance, but a mark the whole world now knew exactly how to find. Sophie herself thanked me personally that evening, telling me she'd kept a framed photo of the altar in her new home. That knowing its full story made it mean even more to her than the ceremony itself had. Real craftsmanship tells the truth eventually, she said, even when people try very hard to hide it. I thought about Everett then, about his old workshop, about the chisels he'd left me instead of the business he'd left Ryan, and understood, finally, that he'd known something the rest of the family had taken 15 years and a public reckoning to fully learn, that the hands matter more than the face. David toasted me at that anniversary dinner, standing before 200 guests, telling the story of the drawer, the wedding, the quiet man who'd stepped forward from the catering entrance and simply, calmly, told the truth in front of everyone who mattered, without raising his voice even once. I've built a career recognizing value other people overlook, David said, raising his glass toward me. Daniel Reyes is the finest example of that I've encountered in 30 years. To the man who builds things that last, and to the truth, which, eventually, always finds its own way to the surface. The room applauded, and I stood, briefly, acknowledging it, thinking of every dinner table where I'd sat silent while someone else took credit for my hands, understanding finally, fully, that the silence had ended not because I'd shouted, but because I'd simply kept building, patiently, until the work spoke for itself. Hollow Oak Reyes Design Studio now employs 11 craftspeople, supplies custom furniture to clients across 6 states, and maintains a small, quiet policy Everett would have approved of completely. Every piece leaving the workshop carries a visible signature now, no longer hidden. No longer a private consolation, simply the truth. Plainly stated. I still visit Everett's grave every autumn, always around the anniversary of that wedding, and I always bring a small offcut of whatever wood I'm currently working, laying it gently against his headstone. We did it. Old man, I tell him quietly. Took longer than either of us probably expected, but we got there. My relationship with my parents remains complicated, imperfect, still healing in uneven, sometimes frustrating stages, but it's honest now. In a way it never managed to be during those 15 quiet years. And honest, I've learned, is worth infinitely more than comfortable. even when it's considerably harder to sit inside. Ryan and I speak occasionally now. Careful, measured conversations. Neither of us pretending the past didn't happen. Both of us slowly, awkwardly figuring out what kind of brothers we might eventually become once the wreckage finally finishes settling into something we can both actually stand on together. I never did respond to Jenna's message. Some part of me suspects I never will. Not out of lingering anger, but because some chapters simply close on their own. Quietly. Without requiring a final conversation to make the ending official or complete in any meaningful sense at all. Walt still works beside me most days. Still offers the same quiet, precise compliments he always has. Still reminds me, whenever I get too deep in my own head about the past, that the work itself has always been the truest measure of a person, regardless of who happens to be watching. David and I have become genuine friends beyond our business partnership. Occasional dinners, long conversations about craftsmanship and legacy and the strange, winding paths that lead people toward finally being seen for who they actually are, rather than who their families found it convenient to believe them to be. Sometimes, late at night, finishing a piece alone in the quiet workshop, I still carve the small oak leaf underneath, not hidden this time, not a secret anymore, but a quiet tribute to Everett, to Hollow Oak, to every year I spent building myself back up from being called, so consistently, a failure. Think, often, about the exact moment I knelt beside that jammed drawer in front of 200 strangers, how small and simple the gesture actually was, and how completely, permanently, changed the entire trajectory of my life. Proof that sometimes the quietest actions carry the loudest, most lasting consequences. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I woke early in my hotel room and drove out to the estate alone, before any other guests were awake, just to stand once more in the empty chapel where everything had shifted. The light came through the windows exactly the way it had that afternoon, months earlier. I ran my fingers along the altar's edge, feeling every joint I'd cut by hand, remembering the exact night I'd finished it. Exhausted, uncertain who David really was, having no idea the piece would eventually become the exact instrument that finally, publicly, separated the truth of my life from the story my family had told. Standing there, I thought about Ryan differently than I expected to, not with rage exactly, but with a strange, clarifying grief for the version of my brother that might have existed if he'd simply learned to build alongside me instead of learning to sell what I built. Year after wasted year. I thought about my father too. About the specific weight of "let it go," a phrase he'd used so casually, so repeatedly, never once understanding that each time he said it, he was asking me to set down a small piece of myself, until eventually there was barely anything left standing in the room. The chapel door creaked open behind me, and David stepped inside, unsurprised to find me there. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into a pew beside the altar. I told him I'd wanted one more quiet moment with the piece before returning home to the ordinary rhythm of my rebuilt life. "You know," David said, "I've thought a lot about why I pushed the confrontation the way I did that day. I could have handled it privately, quietly, the way most business disputes get handled. But I watched your face when Ryan couldn't explain that mechanism, and I saw 15 years in it. I saw a man who'd spent his whole life being told his work didn't matter enough to defend," David continued. "I decided, standing right here, that I wasn't going to let one more room full of people walk past that truth without actually seeing it. Some moments deserve witnesses, Daniel. That one did." I told him I hadn't fully processed, until that exact moment sitting in the empty chapel, how deliberate his choice had actually been. How easily he could have simply switched vendors quietly, and let Ryan's fraud disappear into an unremarkable footnote, the way so many similar injustices simply vanish, unaddressed, every single day. "I don't like injustice," David said simply, "especially the quiet kind. The kind that hides behind family loyalty and business as usual. My own father worked with his hands his whole life and never once got the credit he deserved from the men who employed him. I promised myself I'd notice when I could. We sat together in the quiet chapel for a long while after that, not saying much else. Simply present in the space where an old injustice had finally, publicly corrected itself. Two men from very different worlds who'd ended up, improbably, understanding something essential about each other through 6 pieces of handmade furniture. Before I left the estate that morning, David walked me back toward my car and mentioned, almost casually, that Sophie and her husband had asked whether Hollow Oak might design their future home's furniture collection entirely, an even larger commission than the wedding pieces, spanning years rather than a single event. I accepted before he'd even finished fully describing the scope, understanding clearly now what Everett had always tried to teach me in that first workshop, that the work itself, done honestly and patiently, eventually finds its way toward the people capable of actually recognizing its full value. Given enough time and enough honesty. Driving back to the airport, I called Walt to share the news, and he laughed, genuinely delighted, telling me we'd need to expand the workshop again within the year at this rate. I told him Everett would have loved watching this unfold, watching 2 boys who'd once fought over sanding assignments end up here. Back home, the workshop buzzed with new energy once the Whitfield Family Collection Commission became official. Larger crews, longer hours. But none of the old resentment that used to accompany busy seasons at Reyes Custom Furniture, because every piece now, without exception, carried my name. Openly. Permanently. Undeniably. Frank started stopping by more regularly, sometimes just to watch, occasionally offering small suggestions from decades of running the old shop, suggestions I actually listened to now. Not because I owed him deference, but because some of what he knew, buried beneath years of favoritism, was still genuinely useful knowledge. Your grandfather would be proud of this place, he told me one afternoon, surveying the expanded workshop floor. He'd be proud of you too, Dad, I said, testing the words carefully, watching something soften in his face that had stayed rigid for as long as I could remember him existing. Carol asked, tentatively, if she could help occasionally with the business's administrative side, bookkeeping, scheduling, the kind of behind-the-scenes work she'd quietly excelled at for years without ever receiving much recognition either. A small irony neither of us mentioned directly but both clearly understood without needing to say it aloud. I agreed, cautiously, giving her a limited role at first, watching carefully how she handled it before extending more trust. She proved reliable, careful, genuinely skilled. And slowly, over months, I found myself building something with my mother I'd never quite had before. A working relationship based on actual demonstrated competence. Ryan called one evening, hesitant, asking if he could visit the new workshop, just to see it. No expectations attached. I agreed, curious despite everything, and watched him walk through the space slowly, quietly, studying joints and techniques with an attentiveness I genuinely never witnessed from him before in his entire life. I've been taking classes, he admitted, running his hand along an unfinished cabinet frame. Basic joinery. At the community college. It's harder than I ever gave you credit for, Daniel. Genuinely harder. I used to think what you did looked simple because you made it look effortless. It's not effortless at all. I told him that recognition, however late it arrived, still meant something. That understanding the actual difficulty of a craft was the first real step toward respecting the people who practiced it well. A step he'd apparently skipped entirely during all those years he spent simply photographing and presenting my finished work. We didn't fully reconcile that day. Not in any dramatic, movie-ending way. But something shifted slightly between us. A small crack of genuine humility where there used to be only easy, practice charm. And I found myself, cautiously, willing to let that small crack grow slowly into something more substantial over time. Jenna married someone else the following spring. A quiet ceremony I heard about only secondhand through my mother. No invitation extended. Which felt appropriate. Felt like exactly the right distance for a relationship that had already told me everything I needed to know about where I actually stood in her priorities. Felt. Hearing the news. Mostly a kind of settled indifference. The specific peace that comes from having fully processed a wound rather than simply covering it over. Hollow Oak kept me busy enough, fulfilled enough, that her wedding existed for me as a minor footnote rather than a lingering ache. The Whitfield Home Collection commission grew larger than initially planned, eventually including matching pieces for 2 of Sophie's siblings' homes as well. A multi-year contract that fundamentally transformed Hollow Oak from a small anonymous online shop into a recognized name within an entire region's high-end design community. David and I began discussing, informally at first, then more seriously, the possibility of opening a second Hollow Oak location. This one in North Carolina, closer to the growing client base David had helped connect me with, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, rather than the exploitation I'd survived at Reyes Custom Furniture. Walt, now effectively my workshop manager, started training 2 apprentices himself, teaching them the same patient techniques Everett had once taught me. A small, satisfying continuation of a lineage that had nearly ended the day Everett willed me only his tools while handing Ryan ownership of everything else. I thought often, during that expansion period, about the exact difference between the 2 brothers' paths, Ryan building an identity on borrowed credit that eventually, inevitably, collapsed under its own hollow weight, and myself building slowly, quietly, on actual skill that had simply needed the right witness to finally be seen. Frank asked me once, during a quiet workshop visit, whether I still resented him for the 15 years of dismissal, for co-signing Ryan's expansion loan, for every let it go that had chipped away at me for so long. I told him honestly that resentment was too simple a word for what I actually felt. It's more like grief, I explained. For the years I spent trying to earn something that should have just been given freely. Recognition for work that was obviously good enough the whole time. I'm not angry anymore, Dad. But I haven't forgotten either. Those 2 things can exist together. I've learned. He nodded slowly, absorbing that without argument, and told me he understood, or at least was trying to, which felt like the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. An admission of ongoing effort rather than a false claim of complete, tidy resolution neither of us actually believed. My business relationship with David deepened into something closer to mentorship over that second year. Long conversations about scaling craftsmanship without sacrificing quality, about protecting creative ownership in contracts, about building a legacy that couldn't be quietly stolen by someone more comfortable performing confidence than earning it honestly. You remind me of myself at your age, David told me once, over dinner at his estate. Except I had to learn everything about protecting my own work the hard way, through several painful lessons. You got your painful lesson early. At least. Some people never get it at all. They just keep getting used. I asked him, curious, if he'd ever had his own version of Ryan in his life. Someone who tried to claim credit for work that wasn't theirs. He laughed. A short, knowing sound. Everyone successful has a Ryan somewhere in their story. Daniel. The difference is whether you let them keep winning. That conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward, reframing everything that had happened not as a singular,
Dramatique exception,
but as a pattern common enough that even a man as accomplished as David had lived through his own version of it, decades earlier. In his own long climb toward legitimate success, Hollow Oak's second location broke ground that autumn, exactly 1 year after the wedding that had changed everything. A deliberate timing choice I made without fully planning it. Some part of me wanting the new workshop's foundation poured on an anniversary that finally meant triumph rather than merely survival. Ryan attended the small groundbreaking ceremony, standing quietly at the back, watching without commentary, without performance, simply present in a way that felt, for the first time in either of our lives, appropriately sized to his actual role in this particular story. A supporting one, no longer central, no longer stolen. Frank and Carol attended too, standing together near the front. And when a local reporter asked Frank about his son's success, he said simply, "Daniel built all of this himself, with his own 2 hands. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm saying it now. As loudly as I can." I heard him say it, standing a few feet away, and felt something in my chest finally, fully settle. Not because the 15 years had been erased, but because the truth had finally, publicly, permanently replaced the story my family had told about me for far too long without a single serious challenge. That evening, after the ceremony ended and most guests had gone home, I stood alone in the empty foundation of the new workshop, imagining the walls that would soon rise around it, thinking about Everett, about his chisel sitting carefully in my toolbox, about how far a quiet, patient life could actually travel. I carved a small oak leaf into a support beam before the concrete fully set. Private tradition now. A marker for every new chapter Hollow Oak entered. No longer hidden from anyone. Simply a quiet signature belonging to a man who had finally, fully, stopped needing anyone else's permission to claim his own work. 2 years after the wedding, David invited me to an industry gala in New York, where Hollow Oak was being formally recognized with an award for craftsmanship excellence, voted on by a panel of designers and collectors who had no idea, most of them, about the story behind the small oak leaf mark. I stood on that stage, accepting the award, and found myself thinking not of the ceremony itself, but of the workshop floor back home, of Everett's chisels, of every quiet, unrecognized hour that had led him probably to this exact moment, standing in a room full of strangers who finally, simply, saw the work clearly. In my brief acceptance speech, I mentioned Everett by name, mentioned the small workshop where I'd learned everything that actually mattered, and mentioned, carefully, that sometimes the most important lesson a craftsman learns isn't about wood or joinery at all, but about the courage required to eventually stand behind your own name. I didn't mention Ryan specifically, didn't need to. The story having already traveled widely enough through industry circles that most people in that room already understood the general shape of what had happened, without requiring me to relitigate it publicly on a night meant to celebrate the work itself, not the wound. Afterward, David found me near the bar, raising a glass in a quiet, private toast just between the two of us. "To the drawer that jammed at exactly the right moment," he said, smiling. "Sometimes the universe has better timing than any of us could possibly plan for ourselves, Daniel." I laughed, genuinely, thinking about how close that entire revelation had come to never happening at all, how easily the mechanism could have simply worked smoothly, how the whole confrontation had ultimately hinged on one small, imperfect detail in an otherwise flawless piece of furniture I'd built months earlier. "Maybe Everett had a hand in that timing somehow," I said, only half joking, remembering his old superstitions about wood remembering its maker's intentions. David just smiled and clinked his glass against mine, neither of us needing to fully explain what we each privately believed about how that particular moment had actually unfolded. Back home, business continued expanding steadily, not explosively, but consistently. The kind of sustainable growth Everett had always preached over Ryan's flashier, faster instincts. I hired 6 more craftspeople that year, expanded into custom architectural woodwork, and turned down more commissions than I accepted, protecting the quality above all else. Frank retired from what remained of Reyes custom furniture that winter, the business having shrunk considerably since the scandal, now essentially just a small local repair shop run by 2 employees who'd stayed loyal through the collapse. He spent more time at my workshop instead, finding purpose in a role he actually understood now. Ryan, meanwhile, had slowly built something smaller but honest at his new company, earning a modest promotion based on actual demonstrated sales skill applied honestly this time, without borrowed credit propping it up. It wasn't the empire he'd once imagined, but it was, finally, entirely his own, built the slow, hard way. We had dinner together, just the two of us, for the first time in nearly 3 years that spring. It was awkward at first, both of us navigating years of accumulated history, but somewhere around dessert, we found ourselves laughing genuinely about a childhood memory neither of us had thought about in over a decade. "I think about that wedding almost every day," Ryan admitted quietly, near the end of dinner. Not with anger anymore. Mostly. Just as the moment everything I'd built on the wrong foundation finally came down. I needed it to happen. Daniel. Even though it destroyed everything I thought I wanted at the time. I told him I understood that better than he probably realized. That sometimes the collapse of something false is the only path toward eventually building something real. A lesson I'd learned slowly. Painfully. Through 15 years of watching him succeed on borrowed foundations while I quietly built my own. Unnoticed. Underneath everything. We didn't fully rebuild our relationship that night. But we established something new. A tentative honesty neither of us had ever really practiced with each other before. Built not on old sibling rivalry, but on a shared, hard-won understanding of what it actually costs to build something worth having. That summer, David asked me to design a permanent installation for the Whitfield Family Foundation's new community woodworking program, teaching underprivileged teenagers basic craftsmanship skills. A project that felt, immediately, like the truest possible extension of everything Everett had taught me in that small original workshop decades earlier. I threw myself into that project with an energy I hadn't felt since Hollow Oak's earliest days, designing workstations, sourcing tools, developing a curriculum that emphasized patience over speed, precision over flash, the exact values that had once made me the family's quiet disappointment and had eventually become my greatest, most durable strength. The program's first graduating class included a shy, quiet 15-year-old named Marcus who reminded me uncomfortably of myself at that age. Someone who clearly had real talent but struggled to speak up for himself in a room full of louder, more confident peers competing for the same limited attention. I spent extra time with him, deliberately, remembering exactly what it had felt like to be overlooked, to be told, implicitly and explicitly, that quiet competence mattered less than visible charm. By the program's end, Marcus had built a small side table good enough that I offered him a summer apprenticeship on the spot. Watching him accept, hesitant and disbelieving, I understood something about the full circle this story had traveled, from a boy overlooked in his own family's workshop, to a man building a place where other overlooked craftsmen could finally be seen clearly, judged only by the honest, undeniable quality of their actual work. Frank visited the program's workshop one afternoon, watching me teach a group of teenagers the same dovetail technique Everett had once taught me, and told me afterward, quietly, that he finally understood something he'd missed for most of his life. That real legacy isn't about who inherits a business, but who inherits genuine skill. "I gave Ryan the shop," he said. "But you were always the one actually carrying Everett's legacy forward, Daniel." I just couldn't see it clearly at the time, blinded by things that seemed to matter more back then. "I'm sorry it took this long, and this much pain, for me to finally understand that." I told him I appreciated hearing it, that it mattered even now, even years later than it should have arrived, because understanding, however delayed, was still worth infinitely more than the comfortable silence that had defined most of our relationship for the better part of 3 decades before all of this happened. That autumn, 3 years after the wedding that changed everything, Hollow Oak Reyes Design Studio opened its second location in North Carolina, with Walt overseeing the original Ohio workshop and myself splitting time between both, building a company that finally, fully reflected the actual scale of the skill that had built it. David spoke at the opening, telling the assembled crowd of clients and craftspeople the full story now, openly. The stolen designs, the jam drawer, the truth that had finally stood up in a chapel 3 years earlier, and simply refused to sit back down again once it had been given the chance. I stood beside him, no longer hidden behind a catering entrance, no longer needing a stranger to speak the truth on my behalf, present fully as myself, Daniel Reyes, master craftsman, finally standing exactly where I belonged, in the center of a story that had always, quietly, actually been mine to tell. Ryan attended that opening too, applauding genuinely from the crowd, and afterward found me to offer a simple, sincere congratulations. No bitterness left in his voice, just quiet respect for a brother who had finally, publicly, permanently claimed the recognition that had always, rightfully, belonged to him alone. Jenna's name never came up that day, and I noticed its absence without any particular ache, simply the natural result of time moving forward, of a life fully rebuilt around people who valued honesty over convenience, patience over performance, actual craftsmanship over the easy, hollow shortcuts that had once nearly cost me everything. In the months that followed, Hollow Oak Reyes Design Studio became one of the most respected custom furniture companies in the region, known specifically for the small oak leaf carved into every piece, a mark that had traveled from private secret to public promise, from hidden signature to celebrated legacy. My family, imperfect and still healing, gathered for Thanksgiving that year in my new workshop instead of the old family dining room, surrounded by the very pieces that had once defined my invisibility, now simply, quietly, defining exactly who I had always actually been underneath 15 years of dismissal. Frank raised a toast that evening, looking directly at me for once instead of Ryan, and said, simply, to Daniel, who built everything this family should have been proud of all along. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was, finally, an honest one, and after everything, that honesty meant more than any perfect ending could have. Think, often, about that jam drawer, about how close the truth came to never surfacing at all. And I've come to believe that the world eventually finds its own quiet way of correcting the stories built on someone else's stolen labor, if the person doing the actual work simply refuses to stop building. Everett's chisels still sit in a place of honor in my workshop, worn smooth by decades of honest use. A daily reminder that patience, real patience, the kind that outlasts 15 years of being called a failure, eventually becomes its own undeniable, unmistakable form of quiet, permanent victory. I carved one final oak leaf that year, into the doorframe of the new workshop's entrance, visible to everyone who walks through, no longer hidden, no longer a secret, simply a signature belonging entirely to a man who finally, completely, stopped waiting for permission to be seen. Andy.